Good morning, everybody. And while we get set up, I want to first say and echo a lot of the comments that Larry made about the quality of the work going on at community colleges here in New Jersey. Certainly when we look at a lot of the best practices that are happening nationally, those things are happening here in this very state at a lot of your institutions. But I think overall, I got it. Yeah. Overall, I think one of the larger points to make is about the importance and the status of community colleges in the conversation about student success nationally. We've been talking about student success or observing issues with retention and graduation rates across higher education for a few decades now with little impact on those facts. But when we look at the things that are at the cutting edge of improving student success, things like guided pathways, things like co-requisite models, those are innovations that started and are mostly happening in the community college sector. And so if we want to talk about where to go to look for student success best practices, the community colleges are the place to do it. In fact, we're involved with an initiative with the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, ASCU, where they're talking about reimagining the first year to improve student success. And one of the first things we said in that conversation was, I know you guys are four-year schools and you think you know what you're doing, but the community colleges have the most innovation going on right now. And sure enough, in the next year, they brought in speakers like Tristan Denley from the Tennessee Board of Regents. His name's the president at Gutman Community College. His name's escaping me now. Scott Evenbeck, yes. And brought in those speakers to talk about what community colleges are doing to improve student success and how four-year schools can learn from that. Now, I buttered you up with those niceties to say this. I'm going to present some challenges. I know there are a lot of good things going on, but I think some of the issues that are happening across higher education are also present in the community college sector. And one of the key fundamental challenges we face in higher education and in improving student success is the assumption that academic achievement, that the preparation students bring to us, is the primary indicator of their likely success. And so I'm going to push back on you for the rest of the time I have to talk about how we can better understand that and how that can impact our practices. But please, when I do so, understand that I said those nice things for 45 seconds to start off the top. I'm going to frame this conversation, as you might guess, under a term, and Christine can feel free to cringe if she like. I will say the term non-cognitive quite a bit in the next 30 to 45 minutes. Can we all just take a breath and accept that? If you don't like the term non-cognitive, I'm happy to talk with you about why I enjoy it, and I might even point to it a little bit. But it's important to acknowledge that this also includes things like psychosocial, maybe my least favorite, soft skills, 21st century skills, whichever you prefer. There are also other efforts such as grit, sense of belonging, growth mindset that are, as I will argue, parts of what we call non-cognitive skills. But that generally is a lot of the work that I've been doing during and before my time at ETS. And so I want to share with you what we've learned from that work, both within our work and nationally, and most importantly, how that impacts practice. Because we all know that a test score is not the only thing that matters when it comes to student success. When you say, hey, effort matters, nobody disagrees with you. The social attitudes that students have, those matter. Nobody will disagree with you. But I will argue that our systems and our practices and our policies aren't really built to acknowledge just how important those things are in student success. And the fact is, we still make nearly all of our decisions based on those indicators of academic preparation. There are a couple of broad-based examples of why these factors are important, and this is from a study that was done in some of the economics literature. Two side notes. We have a really robust reference list, so if there's a study I cite in here, I'm happy to share a copy of that. It's an annotated bibliography we put together about a year ago, and also Christine's told me that the slides will be available up on the website whenever we're done here today. So if there's something you like and you want to see, you'll have access to it when we're done. These economists, James Heckman being primary among them, who's done a lot of work in the non-cognitive skills area, he was really looking at the ability of general measures of intelligence to predict success later in life, and found that in a lot of ways those were inadequate, and I'll talk about that. And he was one of the people that really pushed this term non-cognitive into the modern conversation. And in looking back on the findings, he said, it makes total sense that these things matter because they're all throughout the stories we tell in our society. Whether it's Thomas Edison saying that really genius is 99% inspiration and 1% perspiration. Wait, did I get that wrong? Yeah, inspiration, or 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. He's emphasizing that hard work is the key to success, not how smart you are. Whether it's children's tales that we tell, like The Little Engine That Could or The Tortoise and the Hare, at the root of those stories, it's about the message that your success is a product of effort and not a product of innate ability. This is what we want to hear. These are the things that resonate with us as people. And yet, as I've pointed out, we often don't emphasize these things. And to show you a case of how that happens, I want to give you a brief lesson in astrophysics, which I'm sure you all were excited to hear when this slide popped up. This is an oversimplification in a lot of ways, but generally speaking, when astrophysicists were looking at orbital bodies through telescopes, they began to acknowledge that, hey, if we look at the orbital bodies we can see, at stars and asteroids and planets and all those things, and we use those bodies to try to explain how things move about with one another, with what we know about gravity and energy and all these things, we just can't do it. The visible light and the visible matter in the universe doesn't help us really predict how these things can move about. And so what they did was they came up with this idea of dark matter. And they said, this thing, we don't know it exists, but if it existed and it did these things, then it would help us fill in the model. It would help us understand why these bodies move around the way that they do. And so they built models based on dark matter, not having ever observed it. And then when actually the science came about where they were able to capture and observe the physical matter in the universe, not only did they find that dark matter existed, but they found that it was actually most of the matter in the universe. And that physical matter, the light that we see, is a really small proportion of what we see. And so it's this idea that the things we look at, the things that are most prescient to us, are not always the things that matter. Just because we have a test score on the student doesn't mean that that's the most significant predictor, even though we have it and we measure it and we've looked at it for years and years and years. Now again, this isn't my metaphor, this is Heckman and Rubinstein's metaphor. I'm just borrowing it and explaining it a little bit more eloquently. But the point is, you've heard the old story about looking where the light is shining. And in this case, in astrophysics, it was quite literally looking where the light was shining and finding that that wasn't appropriate. And so what Heckman and Rubinstein say is this is the problem with education, is that we have talked about academic achievement for so long and assumed that academic achievement was the thing that matters, when in fact there was all these other factors going on around it that we haven't done a good job of articulating. Getting to the point about institutions, this is a quote from Kay McClinney, the founder of CESI and just a paragon of research and activity in the community college sector. I say a quote, I've cited it here as a hearsay quote because I didn't actually hear Kay say this. I've heard people tell me what Kay said, and so I'm kind of estimating what she said. But basically what Kay said was, our institutions are perfectly built to achieve the results that we see. In other words, we've built a system that is designed to put students through in a particular way. And that's going to continue to put students through in that particular way. Kind of the underbelly of this statement is the old adage, the definition of insanity is repeating the same behavior and expecting different results, right? If we continue to place and support and guide students in the way that we have and expect our retention and graduation rates to improve tomorrow, that's a little foolish, right? We have to change something if we want to see success in that. And so I'm kind of merging together these ideas of if everything that matters aren't the things that we're looking at and we want to improve success rates, maybe we should do that by looking at some of those things that matter that we generally haven't considered. So this gets back to the point of non-cognitive skills and just some brief things about where this came from. When we talk about non-cognitive skills, and I'll say in a second here, we're talking about things like motivation and time management and social connections and leadership and teamwork and all those things. And, my educational psychology folks would say, we've actually been looking at these things for 100 years. I don't know why in the last 5 years, after Angela Duckworth does a TED Talk, are all of a sudden these things important. But as a colleague of mine would say, is we in psychology have known the value of these for a long time. It wasn't until economists started saying they were important that people started paying attention. And there were some really great research in the GED program that I could talk about, but the study that really is my favorite is a large meta-analysis that looked at the prediction of years of schooling of later life outcomes like employment and income and basically workforce outcomes. And what they found was that if you look at the correlation between the number of years that you went to school and these outcomes later in life, only 20% of that relationship can be accounted for by measures of intelligence. Basically, the smarter you get from going to school only has a really small impact in predicting how well you do later in life. If 20% of that effect is based on measures of intelligence or cognitive ability, 80% of the effect of school is subsequently non-cognitive ability. That's where they coined the term in this space, is to say it's not that it's not about cognition or anything, it's about not related to intelligence. It's all these other factors like perseverance and organization and working with others and committing to a goal. And what the authors say, Bowles, Gintis, and Osborne, is, look, that's what you get from going to school. It's that you get this ability to persevere to a goal, to work with others, to interact, to understand that achievement is important, and to value learning. All those things that when I ask you, what did you learn from going to college, you don't tell me, well, I learned how to factor an equation in college algebra. You don't tell, I mean, I learned the presidents of the United States, and I learned the impetus for the Civil War. You say, no, you know what I learned is I learned how to overcome a challenge. You know, I learned that when I have a lot of work, how do I balance those expectations? And the research pans that out to say that if we talk about what we get from school, it's a lot of the things that aren't measured by our traditional indications of intelligence or achievement. Now, how we define what that space is can be done in a lot of ways. And this is where I think there are some efforts that you all have probably heard of that talk about components of this, like grit and sense of belonging and growth mindset and those sorts of things. But really, probably the best way to talk about this is through personality. Right? So the major theory of personality is the big 5 factor. No real need to dive into these things and talk about what these are. Some of the major areas that are probably worth discussing, though, are conscientiousness, which we all probably have some general definition of. But generally speaking, we talk about conscientiousness as all of the achievement-related factors of personality. Organization, perseverance, motivation, drive to a goal, those tend to fall under the conscientiousness bucket. Agreeableness, how well we get along with others, generally speaking. Emotional stability, our susceptibility to stress. You know, the used to be called neuroticism, but we didn't like that term in psychology. Now, what's really important to know is there's a lot of research on the big 5 factors. These are really well empirically established, and some of my colleagues argue that it wasn't until the big 5 came along that we were really able to move forward a lot of this non-cognitive research, because basically everybody could say, yeah, the big 5, that's what personality is. We can't combat that theory. It's got such support. But the biggest thing I have to emphasize to you about this is that these have nothing to do with how smart you are. When you look at meta-analyses about correlations between personality and intelligence, most factors fall around 0.1 correlation, which is essentially nothing. The biggest one, it's correlated about 0.3, which is statistically and in a lot of ways practically significant, but isn't by any means synchronous. So I say this and people agree with me, but I still don't think it's driven home into our practice and what we do every day. The test score that a student brings tells us nothing about how hard they work. We have lots of students that come in that place right into our college level courses that struggle with time management, that struggle with driving to a goal or effort, that struggle with reaching out for help when they have a problem. And we have lots of students that come in and score poorly on our placement test that can do those things in spades. The fact is, when we start to include these factors in our definition of what a successful student is, we get a very different picture because it's wholly unrelated to the things we've looked at in the past. Personality is not a term that many folks like to use in this space because there are a lot of presumptions around personality. One is that personality is fixed, which has largely been disproven through research that looks at personality over time and finds that your personality varies significantly over the course of your life. If you think about yourself as a freshman in college, I hope you would agree with me that the personality you have now is a little bit different. Thankfully, mine is. But one of the other things is when we get into this conversation about focusing on these skills with students, you know, to say that you want to change someone's personality isn't something people get really excited about. Instead, we tend to talk about personality as these contextualized skills and behaviors and mindsets that impact educational success. And that's where I think we start to use this term non-cognitive skills. Because I'm not necessarily interested in changing your personality, but I am interested in helping give you the strategies that might compensate when your personality isn't conducive to success. People come into my office and they think that I am super organized because there are charts and timelines and things all over the place. And they're like, wow, you must be, really organized. And I say, no, I do all those things because I'm terribly disorganized. And I'm not going to change that, but I need some strategies to help me overcome that. So when we talk about these non-cognitive skills, they're really the strategic elements of that personality reflected when a student enrolls and is trying to succeed in college. Sometimes they're predictors of success. Sometimes they're the outcomes of interventions we're trying to have with students. What's really important about this is if we understand that these things tie back to personality, we've got to remember that those areas of personality don't correlate with one another. They're very distinct. That's how they became formulated as 5 factors, because we understood that one factor didn't explain all of those things. We had these 5 distinct areas. And so what that tells us is that a student who comes in with weak study skills, we don't really know what that tells us about their test anxiety, or how well they work in teams, or whether they feel socially integrated at your institution. We can't lump all these things together and think of them as one thing. Whether that's engagement or grit or growth, whatever. It's not one set of skills any more than we can lump organic chemistry and creative writing together and assume, well, that's just all academic stuff. They're very granular. And we emphasize that in our work, not because of a theoretical model, not because of empirical support that we have, but because of very practical reasons. The student who comes in and struggles in time management needs a very different intervention than the student who comes in and doesn't respond to stress well, who needs a very different intervention than the student that doesn't feel like they belong, needs a very different intervention than the student who isn't really sure why they're in college. It's having that particular understanding of the strengths and challenges that students face that puts us in the best position to provide interventions and not just predict success. We can do that in spades. What we're trying to do is improve success. And so we have to identify strengths and challenges and then connect students with resources. Some other means of articulating this, just in case you don't like personality, this is a framework that was done by the National Academy of Sciences. And what they were really talking about were the outcomes of education across the educational lifespan. So they frame this in terms of cognitive outcomes. This includes a lot of our traditional areas of learning, like critical thinking and analytical skills and problem solving. Interpersonal skills, the factors that relate to one another, like teamwork and collaboration. And then intrapersonal skills, those metacognitive strategies, time management, how we respond to stress. So not the framework of doing it, but an example in case you like it. They always say it's not a PowerPoint presentation if there's not one slide you can't read, and this is mine. This is how we define non-cognitive skills in our work, particularly focusing on student success in higher education. Now, again, there are 10 factors in this second column here that really are the meat of the work that we do. They're specific, they're granular, they're the factors that go into our predictive models. When I work with advisors and faculty on how to integrate this into student success, I talk about it at this very granular level. But we have these 4 buckets that I think are helpful to organize the space. The first area is academic skills, which I know for some people means preparation, but it doesn't in our context. Basically, these are the behavioral tools and strategies that students use to succeed in the classroom. Do they study? Do they manage their time well? Do they show up to class? Do they ask questions? Do they get their assignments done? If that's behavioral, the second area we look at is sort of motivational. Are students committed to a college goal of graduation or completion? And we also include institutional commitment in there. The little side note, we don't weight it very heavily in our predictions of success because of our work with community colleges. Even though Vincent Tinto has made everybody put institutional commitment at the top of your retention models, you all know that most of your students are coming, not most, but a lot, if not most, are coming thinking about where they're going next, right? Maybe that's Rutgers or UCNJ or something like that, where they're saying, I'm happy to be here at Bergen, but I'm really thinking about where I'm going next. So even though that student's likely to succeed, they maybe not are high in institutional commitment. The second phenomena is one that's happened more recently in probably the last 10 years, which is the primary reason every student comes, particularly to community colleges, is what? To get a job, right? So I'm not here because I want to join a club and a fraternity. I'm here to get a job, and I don't care whether that's at this school or that school. I'm going to do great, I'm fine, and I'm committed, but institutional commitment isn't necessarily the thing for me. Now, we have four-year schools we work with where that's an important variable, and that's great for them, but just trying to let you know that when we put institutional commitment in our model, it's not deaf to the students that you're dealing with. The third area of self-management is what we might consider our emotional bucket. And this is how students respond to stress, their academic self-efficacy. And then finally, social support, the connections that students have with others. So this includes whether students feel like they belong, it includes how they reach out for help, and then the magical item, how much does family, work, finances hinder your success in college or support your success in college? So I think when we're talking about how do we articulate these non-cognitive skills, particularly as they relate to student success, these are the things that we see as really the core skills based on our research and our work with institutions. I think it's kind of, I always feel like I have to put up the slides to demonstrate how important these factors are, but nobody really ever disagrees with me, like I need to win this argument, but it's fun just to see the studies, and maybe you're going to go write a Title III grant or something, and having this in your background will be helpful. So, one of my favorite studies that espouses the importance of non-cognitive skills in higher education was done by Neil Schmidt from Michigan State and actually some folks at the College Board. The College Board was very interested in looking at holistic admissions, and this is more in the four-year space. And they were trying to figure out if we're going to make better decisions about who we admit and who we don't admit to colleges, we should figure out what factors we're going to consider beyond quantitative and verbal literacy. One of the first things they said was, well, if we want to know what colleges want in their students, we should hear what they tell people they want in their students or in their graduates through their mission statements. And so they actually did a qualitative analysis of 35 mission statements from colleges and universities across the country to say, what pops up all the time in these mission statements? What are the things that colleges say, this is at the core of what we should be doing? I always have to count. I think there are 11 factors on this slide, 12 factors. 12, one of them is cognitive. The other things are all non-cognitive. So when we think of the statements that are supposed to get you excited to come to work every day, we talk about non-cognitive skills. We don't say mastery of college algebra and ability to develop a well-structured essay. We say lifelong learning, citizenship, teamwork and collaboration. Those factors that we want to see evident in our graduates. The other folks who often talk about the importance of non-cognitive skills are employers. Most times and in a lot of fields, employers will say, look, technical skills are great, but in a lot of positions, those are going to be gone in not too long. The half-life of engineering knowledge is 5 years. 5 years after an engineer graduates, half of what they learned in college is obsolete. But what employers will say is, I want people who show up to work. I want people who will work well with others. I want people who won't steal from me. Those are the real decisions that are made by employers. And so when you do these surveys, this is one that was done by the Society for Human Resource Management, where they asked employers to rate factors that are important. There are about 12 or 15 things they asked about. I just pulled out a couple of examples. The number one thing that comes at the top that's not on here is communication. That's consistently rated as the number one skill by employers. Though we've done some research on defining what communication means in the modern setting, and I would argue that communication has both cognitive and non-cognitive components, right? As much as we have to be able to write an essay and speak articulately, we have to be able to look at an audience and understand when they're not getting it, or pick which medium is appropriate given the message that I'm trying to convey. So it's a bit of a complex skill. But right after communication, we get into teamwork. We get into professionalism and work ethic. We get into ethics and morality. That's the not stealing part. Those are the things that employers list at the top as most important. You want to know what's at the bottom? All the cognitive things. They'll say, math, science, English proficiency gets up there because that relates to the communication. And I know that if you're, especially in a community college sector where sometimes you're doing very technical things, that might be a little bit different. But generally speaking, employers will say, I can train them on some specific things on the content knowledge related. But there are a lot of things that I want them to have when they get here, and those are the non-cognitive factors. Sadly, when we ask them how prepared college graduates are, they don't think college graduates are ready to do anything. But I have we can talk about the skills gap and my disagreement with that literature. Part of the reason why they don't think they're ready is because they're not willing to train them, as you all know, and that's why you have to build these workforce prep programs. But that's another conversation for another day. I like all the people say they're important research, but I like the empirical research a little more. This was a meta-analysis done by, and when I say meta-analysis, these are big sample, multi-sample studies that look across lots of literature to try to look at common trends. This was done by Arthur Poropat, and he looked at the relationship between intelligence and personality as a predictor of academic achievement across the educational lifespan. So what you see on the left-hand side here is K8. And the red line represents measures of intelligence or cognitive ability. The blue line represents conscientiousness, those achievement-related behaviors. And the yellow line represents agreeableness, how well students get along with others. So in early educational settings, intelligence is a big predictor of student success and achievement. The other personality factors, statistically and practically significant there, but just not as strong a predictor as intelligence is. When we get into high school, the predictive ability of cognitive ability drops down significantly. It's about equivalent to those achievement-related behaviors that are a part of conscientiousness. You also see agreeableness becomes far less important. I argue that in K8, hitting other students is a really big concern for success. Hopefully that's gone by high school, though sometimes we still even see in college that's not always the case. But the bottom line is by the time we get into higher education, conscientiousness, again, those achievement-related behaviors and attitudes, is just as strong a predictor of achievement as is intelligence. So I always say, if we'd known this, however many, 70, 80 years ago when we built the SAT, maybe we would have built as much a personality test as a measure of aptitude at that time. There's one other, well, there's two more I have here, but one thing that I think is really important as we dive into the student success conversation, and this is where we start to get into some of the challenges to our modern structures, is that when we talk about non-cognitive factors as predicting success, it depends what type of success you mean. This was another meta-analysis done by Steve Robbins and some folks at ACT back in 2004. Steve actually now works with us at ETS on some of our workforce initiatives. But in the first half of the study, again, big study, 2- and 4-year schools, though they later replicated this in both 4- and 2-year samples separated. They found if we want to predict first-year GPA, and we look at both academic and non-cognitive predictors, generally, things like standardized test scores do a pretty good job. They're one of the strongest predictors here. The other factor that pops up is academic self-efficacy, though I would argue that students who are confident about their ability to do well are maybe the same students who did well on things like standardized tests in the past. But the point is, we see this repeatedly in this study and others and in research we've done. If you want to predict future academic achievement, psychology will tell you the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Look at past academic achievement. We can boost the predictive efficacy of those measures with things like non-cognitive tools, particularly those classroom and study-related things. They tend to boost it quite a bit. But the lion's share of that predictive efficacy is largely going to come from measures of academic achievement when you're predicting GPA. The problem is, we're not usually talking about GPA when we talk about student success, are we? We're talking about retention, persistence, graduation, transfer, those sorts of behaviors. And in fact, when we try to predict those things, the story is quite different. Standardized test scores become a weak predictor. They're still statistically significant, but not nearly as practically strong as a lot of these non-cognitive factors. And it makes sense because the future behavior we're looking at is not academic achievement. It's persistence to a goal. It's working with others to get to that goal. And so why wouldn't we look at students' ability or tendency to do that in the past as a predictor of their behavior in the future? Even if they had the utmost predictive efficacy, what happened in this study, I think, is a better message. And there are lots of studies that are saying what this study says, which is, to some extent at least, these non-cognitive factors can help compensate for other challenges that students bring. So this is a study that was done by Kevin Lee and some folks at the City Colleges of Chicago, where they looked at success in developmental math courses. They looked at success as a product of readiness, which is scores on Compass tests, which is what they used in Chicago at the time. Rest in peace, Compass. And then they also looked at that as a product of effort in the course. And what I like about this is effort was actually scored by faculty ratings on a behavioral checklist. Did students show up to class? Did they complete assignments? Did they make eye contact? Did they ask questions? And so 3 weeks in, faculty checked off every student whether they did those things. What they find is, it's students in this high effort column, and I don't know if you can see this, but Students in the high effort, high achievement band, they pass at 92%. Students in the high effort, low achievement band, they still pass three quarters of the time. So, if you show up and do all those things, you are likely to pass the course. I'm sure you're very shocked to hear that assignment completion and attendance are relevant to course completion. But what's interesting is what happens when you go down levels of effort within levels of achievement. So those high achieving students, even when they don't do anything, they still pass 6 times out of 10. This is a developmental math course. Maybe they knew it and just didn't take the placement test seriously, or maybe they're smart enough that they don't need to show up to class every day. But the bottom line is, yeah, their success goes down, but again, even when they're not doing anything, they can still pass the course more often than not. But those medium and low achievement students, their success rates plummet when that effort isn't present. So those co-curricular behaviors are important, but they're even more important for the students that are bringing in some challenge. And I think this is one of the key messages as we start to look at how do we not just better predict success, but how do we improve success? So this goes from the research to practice component, right? Because we can know all the things that I just told you in this study, but none of those things really told you what you're going to do differently when you get back to your campus on Monday. And I think that's where I really try to do a lot of my work, is in, as Christine said, working with institutions to inform practice using these non-cognitive data and skills. Because just measuring them and having the data does nothing. It's got to be a chain of data to information, information to action. One of the ways that we talk about this is through interventions. And this might be a common term you hear if you follow this literature, which is, I can identify a student that has challenges in these areas, but what do I do to help them improve? And so we talk about interventions. Interventions, in my mind, sound and at their face are a little bit abstract, right? There's like this experiment or there's an activity, but that doesn't tell me what I do or to fit that. But one of the first things that's important to say is that interventions have been demonstrated to be really effective. There's a broad body of work in what in K-12 sectors is called social emotional learning. I think there's even somebody giving a session today on social emotional learning, I think I saw. There we go, I'll be there. But in K-12 they call it social and emotional learning, and they compare and contrast that with academic learning. And what they found in the K-12 setting in large studies was that if you do these social and emotionally oriented interventions with students, not only does it improve their academic outcomes, but it improves academic outcomes at a higher rate, or at least an equivalent rate, and oftentimes higher, than interventions that are specifically targeted at academics. So it's basically saying, it's not that these students can't learn, it's that a lot of these social emotional things are getting in the way, and focusing on academics isn't going to take care of the social emotional part. If we can help address the social emotional, this part will take care of itself, because that's what teachers and faculty and instructors are already doing. There's far less conclusive literature, and not to say that there's any negative evidence, but just not the same level of support for interventions in the higher ed space. There is a really great study that was done by David Yeager and Greg Walton, where they looked at a review of studies, a lot of which are in higher education, some are in more high school settings. But the title of the article, I love it, is Social Psychological Interventions, They're Not Magic. And they found that a lot of interventions could have significant impacts on a lot of long-term student academic and enrollment outcomes. But in looking across those interventions, they found 3 real keys to doing this work with students. One is that they have to be psychologically sound. And I think this is where the non-cognitive work maybe comes in to inform a lot of the things that we've done in areas like engagement and generally student affairs type practices. Is we've just generally assumed that getting students more involved is a good idea. And there's a lot of research that says on the aggregate, yes, that works. But what Yeager and Walton talk about is you've got to take a real critical look at how what you're doing relates to the factors that are impacting students at a psychological level. Is it the fact that they don't have confidence in themselves? Is it the fact that they haven't clearly articulated a goal? Is it the fact that they've come to your campus and they just don't feel like they belong there? And when they don't feel like they belong, if they run into a problem, they're not going to ask for help, and that problem's going to escalate and they're going to be gone. How do you help address those issues? And to do that, you've got to think about it with a keen psychological eye. Because, frankly, a lot of times we build resources and we open the door and students didn't show up. We have said, well, we built the tutoring center, we just can't get students to go. Or when you ask faculty about why students don't pass their class, they say, well, they stopped coming to class. that's an engagement level observation. It's not a psychological level observation. So first, we've got to start with understanding what are the key psychological phenomena that are impacting our students. The second thing that they emphasize is interactivity. And this is probably not a surprise, but it's not as effective to stand up and lecture to students about academic self-efficacy as it is to have them engage in an activity that actually builds academic self-efficacy. And the third thing is that these things have to be hidden. And what they would argue is that you can't even actually tell students you're trying to build their academic self-efficacy. So one of the things that they did was they did an intervention with first-generation college students where they had them write an essay about values and things that were important to them. And you know, it was just supposed to, in the student's eyes, it's just an essay, right? It's just something they have me do on the first day of class. But psychologically, what they're doing is they're having the students affirm that what they think matters and that they belong, and that if they bring those things up, they're going to be totally welcome to express those ideas. Significant impacts on academic success for those students compared to other students who were randomly assigned to some innocuous essay activity. Now, the way that we tend to integrate these data in our practice is through a couple of different areas that I want to talk to you about in some more depth. One of those is holistic advising. And I always use the term advising with caution because I know in California, they don't call anybody advisors. You can't even use the word on a lot of campuses. In other places, there are advisors and coaches and counselors, and it varies from school to school, state to state. Generally, when I talk about advising, I'm talking about people who are talking to students about their success. Whether that is an advisor, a coach, a counselor, a faculty member, or maybe somebody who's just working in the tutoring, I mean, it could be anybody. But if you're going to sit down and talk with a student about their success, it makes sense to have some conversations about these non-cognitive skills. The second area, particularly where a lot of the interventions take place, are in our existing co-curricular programs, services, and supports. And so not just saying, how do we build a resource that students need? How do we connect them with that, particularly when they have a high level of need? Because frankly, the students that come in and are low in help-seeking tendency aren't going to show up for those things, and they're the ones that need help the most. My old joke is, this is why your tutoring centers are filled with more B+ students trying to get an A than they are D+ students trying to get a C. Because good students seek help. It's the students that struggle that don't come and reach those resources. In psychology, we call this the Matthew effect, that making a resource available to a population doesn't close achievement gaps. It oftentimes actually expands them because more capable individuals access them more readily. And then lastly, I just want to talk about a new initiative we've been working on that I think has a lot of promise in the community college sector in particular, integrating some things into some more, I don't want to say pedagogical, but more of a classroom type setting. One of the examples of holistic advising that's worked really well for us is a model at Santa Monica College. Santa Monica College, I think they're one of the top 20 biggest community college systems in the country. We've been working with them for 5 years now. And they do a really interesting model where they implement our assessment through their student success course and then have a very progressive means of using data at multiple levels to impact practice. At the highest level, what we did for them was we ran some local predictive models to say, look, not only are these factors relevant, but here are the particular factors that tend to be more predictive of success within your institution. So that was helpful for them to see that we're not just assessing these things, but that they actually matter to our students. We then drilled those data down into their student success course. And what I could do was run reports on those factors for each instructor by section. And then we mapped our non-cognitive skills to the curriculum of that student success course. Because those student success courses, oftentimes, either implicitly or explicitly, are trying to target a lot of these non-cognitive things. And so then instructors could say, my Tuesday morning 9 o'clock class is really struggling in time management. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the study skills section. But they're really good in the degree planning or commitment to college goals area. So I'm going to take a little bit less time on that. So they're able to tailor their curriculum and instruction and interaction with students based on the overall strengths and challenges that they had. Then finally, at the individual level, in California, you may have read about this. I think there was an article in Inside Higher Ed or one of those recently. California's had a boom in student success funding from the state, something like $840 million over the last 3 years. So every school has a pot of money they can use for some of these student success efforts. they actually hired a counselor, a trained counseling psychologist, who specifically targeted focusing on these non-cognitive skills. And so when we identify a student that has a certain number of challenges, she schedules more one-on-one work with that student to help improve their success. And then they're not just focusing on those things at the aggregate level, but drilling that down to the individual conversations they have with students. We also do a lot of work in the course placement arena. If you're familiar with the holistic placement and testing model, you can use non-cognitive measures to inform those decisions. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. And we actually do work with a very small number of schools that want to use non-cognitive assessment just as a better means of placement. We want something other than the placement test, which I have to say is welcome to folks that interpret multiple measures as we're now going to use 2 math tests. But when you use multiple measures to try to get these non-cognitive factors to make decisions about students, it's real compelling to say, hey, great, we identified students with strong skills, we can bump up into the college level, that improves our college level placement rates, shorten the path to success, those are good things. But what I always emphasize is it's about placement plus support, right? So not just placing students where they're most likely to succeed, but then figuring out what supports they need. Because not only have we become better at identifying students who can succeed, we've become better at identifying students who can fail. And so when we put those students in remedial education and now have said, not only were you low on a test score, but you were low on all these other things, so we're just going to put you down in remedial education without an additional layer of support, that's a real challenge for those students. Lastly, I want to talk about some of the interventional stuff that we've been working on. And so in the Yeager and Walton study I mentioned, one of the things that they found was really common was the use of writing as a tool for having students articulate and interact with these non-cognitive skills. And so what we did was we went back to our framework of non-cognitive factors and did some consideration, and we built writing tasks attached to a few of our key non-cognitive constructs. So what these tasks can be used for is, in a developmental ed or even entry college level comp course, oftentimes faculty just say, hey, write an essay on anything you want. If you're going to write a procedural essay, you can write it on how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or whatever you want to do. And we said, well, if we're going to have students writing, let's have them write about some of these non-cognitive social psychological factors that we know drive their success. So we created one here, this is just one example, called the college level class. And we basically have students write an essay on, what do you think a college level class is going to be like? How do you think that's going to be similar or different from what you experienced maybe in high school? Talk about what you think those expectations are. And so they can talk, we give them some keys to talk about like attendance and assignments, basically trying to get them to the point where they not only say, hey, I'm going to have to work a lot harder on my own, but maybe one of the biggest things about a college level class is what I do in one section could be very different from what's expected of me in the next section, and getting them to be aware of that. What I like about these tasks is that you can treat these just like writing tasks. Faculty can take their traditional Comp 1 or whatever rubric they use and just fit it right on top. But we also built rubrics for the non-cognitive skills. So you can look at these things and say, are students keying in on some of the key expectations? If they haven't, then we know that that's a challenge for them. And just like you would iteratively work with them on those writing skills, you can now also iteratively work with them on those non-cognitive factors. Now this is a little bit tough to implement. We haven't done it yet. We just built these things a couple of months ago. They're going to be piloted at a community college in Illinois coming up in the fall, and if anybody else wants to use them, you're welcome to as well. But part of the challenge is, the writing faculty will know how to do the writing part, and they can handle that, but they probably need somebody to come in and help address the non-cognitive part. Similarly, you could do these as part of a student success course, and the instructor will hopefully know how to foster some of the non-cognitive components, but maybe you want to bring in a writing faculty to help address some of the writing components. So those sort of practical issues are things we're going to look into, as well as look at just generally the overall effectiveness of these things moving forward. But other than just identifying that a student has a challenge and we need to connect them with maybe the tutoring center, this is a means of getting a little bit more involved. As I mentioned, this is maybe one of the last things I'll stop with. Course placement is where we've done a lot of work in the multiple measures arena, and we've seen some really good success with schools, not just in increasing their rates of college level placement by identifying students that we can accelerate into shorter paths or into college level courses, but we've seen that if that acceleration is targeted at students who have strong non-cognitive skills, in every case we've seen, they succeed as well or better than students who are placed into those courses based on test score alone. Again, because the non-cognitive factors matter so much in the course success, and we've picked students that are strong in those areas. Getting back to the point of kind of challenging our structures, I have to say, and this is just across higher education, I laugh at the fundamental premises of developmental education in a lot of ways, because a student didn't learn math and English in 12 years of formal education, but we think 15 more weeks will do the trick. So we're going to put them in another course, even though all the courses they've taken didn't get them to learn it to this point. Now, it makes sense, because if you build developmental ed, if you think about how that structure was built, we went to faculty and we said, what do students need to know to go into a college level course? And they said, this is it. Here's the level. Here's the cut score. If students can't know and do this, they've got to go into developmental ed. And immediately, that level of knowledge or skill is the coin of the realm. Accordingly, if we're going to estimate where students are, well, we should use a placement test that focuses on those academic things, right? And secondarily, if students come in and they're below that, well, they need more academic interventions, because we've got to get them caught up. And the key thing here, what my slide says that you can't read, is the goal is academic preparation. The goal is demonstrating that cut score. Because until you know those things, you're not ready for prime time. We tend to think about things not based on what students know, but based on what students are most likely to do. And I think about this as a success-based paradigm. And in this case, what we acknowledge first is that both academic and non-cognitive factors matter in student success. So first, we need to measure both academic and non-cognitive factors. But secondly, if a student comes in and we think they're not likely to succeed, it's not just academic interventions, i.e. courses, that are on the table as things we can do. We need to be aware of the co-curricular programs and supports that can also help them succeed. But what's most important about this is that the goal of this paradigm is completion. And the point is not to say that we're trying to put students in the easiest or shortest path. We're just trying to churn them through. But the point is, if you build a developmental sequence, and sorry if this is one of you guys, that has 5 developmental sections that students have to progress through, and statistically we know that nobody ever does that, that doesn't make sense to build that system, right? We can still have academic rigor and quality, but build systems through which students are more likely to succeed. And so making that placement decision not about what course is a student most likely to pass, but based on in what situation can we put a student where they're most likely to succeed. That's where the brilliance of co-requisite models comes into play, right? We know that those students need that academic support, but putting them in an extra semester isn't increasing their likelihood of success. If we marry that support with an existing course, well, now we know that they're going to do just fine. And so that's where I think the holistic placement and support model really has a benefit, because it's, again, challenging the way that we've traditionally thought about placement. And I can tell you, I've visited probably 50 or 100 campuses in the last 2 or 3 years. Faculty don't always believe this. I don't know if faculty in the room, a couple meek hands, yeah, sorry about the placement thing. It's a tough sell to tell faculty, hey, they scored 3 points below the cut score, but we can put them in a college level class and they will do just fine. And that's not always an easy thing to say, but we've got tons of data to demonstrate it. Moving forward, this is just more kind of a broad statement about these non-cognitive things. I've talked a lot about this as a co-curricular issue, right? Where we talk about non-cognitive factors as the things that predict and affect students' success in our traditional academic paths. There are a lot of other curricular issues. Yep, sorry, not co-curricular, curricular. There are a lot of other curricular issues that I think we still need to address. And this is more the cutting edge of where we are in terms of identifying things like teamwork and citizenship and cultural competency as the outcomes of what we're doing. I'm glad Gail Fernandez is here from Bergen. We've been working with them on a pilot we're doing of some assessments of civic competency. And are you doing intercultural competence too? Just civic competency. But in any case, this is kind of the next thing, is when we don't just talk about these things as predictors of success, but as the outcomes of what we're trying to do in higher education. And so I think this is something to look forward to in the future. Now, one final thing I'll say, I've been up here for a little while, so you know me, and we can be friends at this point. My job is to go to colleges and universities and help them solve problems. I love the work that folks like David Yeager and Angela Duckworth do, and it's very important. It's advanced our field. But frankly, David Yeager and Angela Duckworth are faculty. Their job is to publish reports, and they're great, and they're very informative. Read their books, they'll be very helpful. But I'm here to be a resource, and so if you have any questions, or you want to talk more about this, or you want me to come to your campus, always happy to do so. So wish you the best of luck both today and moving forward in trying to improve student success. You guys are doing critical work, and as Larry mentioned, it's been successful thus far, but under Christine's guidance, I think it will continue to be even more so. So thank you very much.
What's your take on developing these non-cognitive skills in online courses?
We run into this issue a lot because our assessment models are mostly built on more traditional settings. So we'll ask a question like, do you raise your hand in class? And people that do online education will come back and say, well, we don't have class, students don't raise their hands. And I kind of go back to the personality aspect of it of, this isn't a survey, I'm not actually trying to see if you're actually raising your hand, I'm trying to see if you generally get engaged in a classroom setting. I think we don't know a lot about it at this point. Certainly they're critical factors, and I would argue even more so in a setting that relies more on your personal drive to succeed in a lot of online settings. But I think the research is just more limited. I don't think I could really venture a guess in saying what's similar, what's different. But other than saying there's certainly probably different sets of skills, and we have little information about interventions in a traditional setting. We certainly don't have a ton of information about interventions in an online setting. So it's a great question, but not one we have a good answer for at this point. So we have a test, we have an assessment we call Success Navigator that I've been trying not to cram down your throats all day. That's what we use as our multiple measure. My emphasis would be that it's not about the test, it's about how well you use it. And that's why I think the work, humbly speaking, or well, the opposite of humbly speaking, the work that I do is really important because we can't just give you data, we've got to help you figure out how to integrate those data into strategies. And that's what I've been talking about. So I'd be happy to give you some more information, or you can go to our website, it's ets.org/Success Navigator and find out more there.
We live in a globalized world. We are increasingly interdependent with the global events. Do we have the knowledge of how is this being handled in other countries?
Absolutely. So we have a big research center at ETS that focuses on international assessment. A good colleague, I just had coffee with him yesterday, Jonas Bertling, specializes on comparing countries. And so he worked on the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, and they looked at OECD, who runs that, has started to look at how they can better promote these factors in different international contexts. And it's pretty clear that two things. They matter everywhere. I don't know necessarily we've looked at the similarity or difference in how much they matter. But the other thing is that there are a lot of cultural things that go into the way that students perceive these things. I'll give you one example. When they ran the first study on the PISA data, they found that across or within countries, within any given country, more effort meant more student success, higher levels of achievement. When they looked across countries, they found that the countries that reported the highest level of achievement, or highest level of effort, had the lowest level of achievement. And when they went and looked at it, they realized there was a huge cultural bias in the way that students perceive this. So if I'm in Singapore, highest math scores in the world, I go home, every student goes home and studies 3 or 4 hours a night. So if I go home and study 3 or 4 hours a night and you ask me how hard I work, I'll be like, well, I work as hard as everybody else does. But if I'm in urban East St. Louis and I went home and studied for 45 minutes, which is 45 minutes more than everybody else, I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread. I'm putting forth tons of effort. And so it's understanding the culture that goes into influencing that and how that impacts the way we assess and talk about these skills. But certainly we still see that within every country, the relationship between these things and student achievement exists. Did I answer your question? I'd highly recommend looking at the PISA work and what OECD is doing to understand a little bit more internationally on that.
Thank you all, and Ross, thank you for a terrific presentation.